Okay, so we are on part two of chemistry. And remember, we first part covered everything up to inorganic compounds. So now let's talk about organic compounds. These are a little bit more interesting. I think you'll find it intriguing when we start talking about carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nucleic acids. So, organic compounds, they always contain carbon. Carbon can combine in a variety of shapes. Carbon compounds do not dissolve easily in water. And carbon compounds are a good source of energy. When we look at organic compounds, it's typically made up of very, very long carbon chain. And at the very end of that long carbon chain is a functional group. Okay, the functional groups, the biggies that you should be comfortable with, is going to be a hydroxyl group, which is the reactant. And at the end of that reactant, whatever that long carbon chain is, you're going to see an OH. That's your hydroxyl group. Alcohols contain a hydroxyl group, which is polar and hydrophilic. Hydrophilic means it likes water, compared to hydrophobic, does not like water very much. Molecules with many hydroxyls groups, they dissolve easily in water. Okay, another functional group is a carboxyl group that I think is important. Again, you're going to have your reactant, your long carbon chain, and then there'll be a COOH at the end. Carboxyl acids contain a carboxyl group at the end of that carbon skeleton, that long carbon chain. You'll see when I cover protein or I cover amino acids, you'll see that they have this COOH functional group at the end. The negatively charged form predominates at the pH of the body cells and is again hydrophilic. Another group that we'll talk about are phosphates and the amine groups. Phosphates are this PO4. You have your phosphate with 4 oxygens there. Again, very hydrophilic. It's important. A classical example will be ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Amines, again, you're going to have that long carbon chain, and at the very end, you're going to see NH2. NH2. When we see NH3, that's ammonia. Okay, the body is going to excrete that from the body. So we're going to function primarily on NH2. So here is the carboxyl group again, COOH. It acts as an acid. Why does it act as an acid? It's going to release hydrogen or a proton to become COOH. We're going to see COOH in fatty acids, in fats, and proteins, amino acids. NH2, the amine group, this can accept or release hydrogen, depending on the pH, right? So it makes it a pretty good buffer. We'll see that in amino acids. Hydroxyl groups, the OH, it may link molecules through, here's that group, dehydration synthesis. We'll see the OH group in carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And then the PO4, this is associated with the high energy bond. We're going to see that in phospholipids. Phospholipids. So we're going to see that phospholipids make up a big portion of the cell membrane. All right. We'll also see nucleic acids, which we'll talk about, and high energy compounds. Let's look at carbs first, the carbohydrates. Sugars and starches. These are carbohydrates. They make up about half of the American diet. Typically, when we talk about the standard American diet, we will see this abbreviation SAD, SAD. It really stands for the Standard American Diet. So the SAD diet, and for most people it is pretty sad, but the carbohydrates make up half of the U.S. diet, and not the good carbohydrates. I think many people are eating improperly. They're consuming the wrong types of carbohydrates, bad carbohydrates that are pretty toxic to the body, and not enough of the good carbohydrates. But carbs are an important source of energy for the human body, and they come in three different sizes. There's monosaccharides, which are the smallest, disaccharides, a little bit bigger, and polysaccharides, the biggest. Carbs are a diverse group of substances formed by carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just kind of the way these things are arranged. It's the ratio of one carbon atom for each water molecule. The term carbohydrates literally means watered carbons. Its glucose is 6 carbons and 6 water molecules, or 6 H2Os. And when we combine that, you see there on the bottom there, it's C6H12O6, which is glucose. Its main function, source of energy for ATP. It forms about 1% of the total body weight. And although glucose is very important, we will find out that too much of something or too little of something is very bad for us. So if we have too much glucose in the body, then our body can store that. It'll put it away safely. Like having too much money in your pocket is dangerous. We can put it in the bank. It's there for when we need it. If you look at the word glycogen, the ending ogen, O-G-E-N, we will see that in a lot of words. Whenever we see ogen at the end, it means it's inactive. Glycogen is inactive sugar that can be activated, and when it's activated, it ends in OSE, glucose. So glycogen is stored primarily in your liver and in muscles. And when we are depleted in our diet of glucose, we can tap into the liver and tap into muscle, break down that glycogen, activate it into glucose. Okay? It's so interesting that our muscles have lots of mitochondria, right? Any part of the body that requires lots of energy and they're always working for us need to have mitochondria to help produce ATP or produce energy. So muscles, the heart, the brain, always working for us, lots of mitochondria. They require lots of energy in the form of ATP. So the mitochondria and glucose being stored in muscle, right? You have the two that are very close to one another. So when your muscles need fuel and it's not in the diet, it taps right into itself, right into the muscle for fuel. And glycogen is broken down, and the way it's broken down, it's called glycolysis. Again, there's the word lysis, which means breaking down. It literally takes glycogen, breaks it down into glucose, okay? And now glucose can enter the cell, and the glucose has to be broken down further and further and further eventually to give us that ATP, okay? But the very first step of breaking glucose down into pyruvic acid is called glycolysis. So let me see if I can get my pen up here for a second. Let's get this pen and make it a little bit easier to follow. So here is, let me get this. Okay, so you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides. And then in between at each of these corners is a carbon. So we have a 6 carbon sugar. Okay. Glycolysis is taking the 6 carbon sugar and splitting it right in the center. It breaks this bond, and we're breaking this bond. when we break those two bonds, what you're left with is 2 3-carbon sugars. 1, 2, 3. Again, 1, 2, 3. So we're taking a 6-carbon sugar, splitting it, that's called glycolysis, and we get 2, 1, 2, 3-carbon sugars. This is called pyruvate. I'm just going to put a P there for short, pyruvate. Pyruvate can now enter. By the way, the glycolysis, when you're looking at a cell, here's the cell, here's the nucleus. Glycolysis takes place here in the cytoplasm. And once you have pyruvate, pyruvic acid or pyruvate, that in the presence of oxygen can enter into the mitochondria. And in the mitochondria, we have something called the Krebs cycle. I'll put a K there for Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle. That's the first thing. And then we also have something called the electron transport chain, the ETC. Both the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain are found deep within the mitochondria. And the purpose of these, the purpose of the Krebs cycle, is to make these coenzymes. The coenzymes are NAD and FAD. The N comes from niacin, which is B3, and the F, or flavonoid, comes from B2. So vitamin B2 and vitamin B3 are really needed, actually B1, B2, and B3 are really needed for energy production, especially for the Krebs cycle. But once we have these coenzymes, NAD and FAD, those are going to be utilized for the electron transport chain to produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's why your B vitamins are really important. And the electron transport chain, what's really important for that to work is going to be iron, Fe2+. Iron is really important. And coenzyme Q10. CoQ10 it's called. Really important for energy production. Right? So you'll be hearing about me talking about this throughout the term. Electron transport chain needs iron and CoQ10 for energy production. We know that iron is also found in blood and hemoglobin. And this is why women, during that time of the month, when your monthly bill comes and you're menstruating and you lose blood, you're losing iron. That iron is also needed for ATP or energy production. You may not have a whole lot of energy. It also explains when someone's anemic and they have too little iron. Again, the electron transport chain can't make a lot of energy, ATP, so you're tired. Also, in order to make lots of energy, we also need magnesium. Guess where magnesium is found? In dark chocolate. Is it no wonder during that time of month you may be craving that sugary dark chocolate, magnesium, to help with the energy production? Pretty cool how that works, right? Okay, so glucose is stored as glycogen because glucose in high concentrations is toxic. It's toxic to the brain, it's toxic to neurons, it's toxic to blood vessels. It just destroys them. So we put it in the liver and in the muscle. We know in long distance runners, if you look at marathon runners, they're not short and stocky like me. They're very long, they're very slender. Their muscles are being utilized for energy. And when there's no more glucose left in the muscle, then it taps into the liver. And when the liver is tapped out, that's when it's called hitting the wall, when the person collapses just before the finish line in the marathon. Glucose is also needed. It's part of that D and part of the R, because remember anything that ends in O-S-E, ose, like ribose, deoxyribose, we need sugar for that, right? So sugar is the building block of DNA and RNA. Things can be written, all atoms can be written out this way, or it can be written out in shorthand, right? So if you look at the top left, we see the carbon, we see the hydrogens, the hydroxide, that's C, one carbon, H2, and then OH, right? Remember, that's your hydroxyl group. Carbohydrates provide the most energy. We have monosaccharides. These are simple sugars that contain 3 to 7 carbons. Monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, galactose. And then the deoxyribose in DNA and ribose in RNA. Glucose is the main blood sugar. Fructose is found in fruit, and galactose is found in milk and sugar. Okay? Fructose is found in fruit. If you consume too much fruit, that can raise your triglycerides. When fructose is too high in the body, like high fructose corn syrup, really not good for us. It gets stored in the liver, and people end up developing fatty liver disease. It's called NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And when the liver gets infiltrated with fructose, the liver cells become functionless, and it can actually lead to cirrhosis and destruction of the liver. So have to be careful with the amount of fruits that people consume. Okay, disaccharides. These are simple sugars formed from the combining of 2 monosaccharides, so bringing glucose and fructose together. If you bring glucose and fructose, we get sucrose. That's your table sugar. If we bring glucose and galactose together, you get lactose, which is a milk sugar. When you bring 2 glucoses together, you get maltose, which is found in beer, right? A malted beer. Polysaccharides, an example of that would be glycogen. Glycogen is the stored form of carbohydrates in animals. So again, when glucose gets too high in us, then we store it in the liver and we store it in the muscles in the form of glycogen. That would be the equivalent to starch in plants, right? So when glucose is highly concentrated in the plant, then what ends up happening is that ends up becoming stored as starch. That's the stored form of the carbohydrate in the plant. So consuming starches is not that healthy for us either, right? If it's toxic to the plant, it can't be that healthy for us. Cellulose is the part of the cell wall in plants that cannot be digested by humans, but it can certainly aid in the movement of food through the intestines, right? Almost like a fiber. Okay, so disaccharides. These are formed by combining 2 monosaccharides together. When we're going from something smaller to larger, that is dehydration synthesis. So sucrose is table sugar. It's formed from combining glucose and fructose. Maltose is bringing 2 glucoses together, and lactose is bringing glucose and galactose together. All carbohydrates, except for monosaccharides, need to be broken down by hydrolysis or hydrolysis. That's going from right to left. Sugars can be stored as fat for energy. That's what triglycerides are. Triglycerides are nothing other than sugar stored in a fat cell. So the more sugar that you have, if you're not exercising and requiring that energy, that sugar is stored in a triglyceride. That's why people can lower their triglycerides simply by expending energy, by exercising. The artificial sweeteners cannot be broken down. It becomes toxic. It ends up being stored in the liver, and the liver has to break those down. That's your like NutraSweet or Sweet and Low, your aspartame or aspartame. These things are very, very toxic for the human body. It's found in diet soda, diet Snapples, all of those things. It's really dangerous to consume, so try and stay away from that stuff. A lot of people think, if someone's diabetic, then they can end up consuming the diet products because there is no sugar. If you look at a lot of the ingredients, sugar is sucrose. What we often see as an artificial sweetener is Splenda or sucralose. Sucralose is pretty toxic as well. That's what you find in Splenda. It's an artificial sweetener. What they find is that people that consume diet soda actually end up gaining weight because it activates the sweet tooth, because the sucralose is much, much, much sweeter, somewhere between 5,000 to 8,000 times sweeter than regular sugar. So what that does to neurology, it increases the person's craving for sugar. All right, we spoke about the polysaccharides already, the starch. That's the storage form of glucose in plants. High concentration of glucose in plants or animals is toxic, so that surplus of glucose is converted into starch for safety. For us, glycogen is the storage form of glucose in animals. Glycogen, we said, is stored in liver. The liver cells are called hepatocytes, and in muscles. If your serum glucose levels fall, the glycogen can be converted into glucose. And there's cellulose again. Cellulose is dietary fiber. And there's water-soluble fiber that is found in fruits and vegetables. And then there's insoluble fiber such as nuts and grains that are very helpful in lowering cholesterol. The reason why it can lower cholesterol is fiber is like a sponge in the intestines. It can absorb toxins and it can absorb cholesterol, and you can decrease that through bowel movements. I remember I had a patient years ago, her cholesterol was 500, and that was her being on a statin drug, like simvastatin, Crestor. These are statins designed to inhibit the liver's ability to produce cholesterol. The liver is the organ that makes cholesterol. It does it primarily in the evening, so people that use these statin drugs must take them in the evening, not in the morning, in the evening, so that the liver doesn't make cholesterol. It has its problems as well, because remember, cell membranes are made of cholesterol. The brain is made up of cholesterol. Vitamin D is needed. You need cholesterol. You need that type of fat. So you have to be real careful with a lot of those medications that deplete statins. One of the black box warnings with those happens to be dementia, right, or cognitive impairment due to pulling out cholesterol from the brain or not being able to produce it for brain cells. So when the liver makes cholesterol, the excess ends up being removed from the body, and you need fiber and healthy bowel movements to do that. The woman that had the 500 cholesterol on a statin drug, the first question I asked her was, when was your last bowel movement? And she looked up, and then she used her fingers and she started counting what day is today, and she said about 6 days ago. Oh my gosh, right? So that was the main reason for her cholesterol being so high. She couldn't eliminate and remove it. As soon as we worked on her diet and increased the fiber in her diet, she was just eating pasta, a lot of whites, very dehydrated. In less than 1 week, it dropped to just a little bit over 200. Okay, so diet has major impact on cholesterol. When I say diet, I don't mean that the types of foods can increase your serum cholesterol. It doesn't quite work that way. But the right foods to help with elimination, that's a biggie. Okay, so let's look at fats. The appropriate term is lipids. And under lipids, there are fatty acids, triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, eicosanoids. And then we'll talk a little bit about some fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin K, vitamin E, vitamin A, CoQ10. We'll talk about those. But fatty acids used to synthesize triglycerides and phospholipids, or catabolized to generate ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Triglycerides are used for protection, insulation, and energy storage. Phospholipids, you've heard me say a few times, it's a major part of the cell membrane. When we get into the cell, you will see that there is the phosphate portion, which is hydrophilic, and then a lipid portion, which is hydrophobic. And the cell membrane is considered to be a phospholipid bilayer. It's two layers of phospholipids. It helps to keep what's outside of the cell on the outside and what's inside of the cell on the inside. Steroids is another classification. You could see sterol in cholesterol, right? There's the steroid. Cholesterol is a component of animal cell membranes. It makes up about 20% of the cell membrane. It's the precursor to bile salts. So then when we look at bile salts, the bile is needed to break down fat. The gallbladder is actually what secretes it, and your liver is what makes it. Cholesterol is needed for vitamin D and for steroid hormones. Vitamin D is needed to help absorb calcium, and vitamin D is also needed for bone growth and repair. And they actually discovered that every organ of the body actually has vitamin D receptors. In order for us to produce vitamin D, because it is a hormone, you need sunlight, you need cholesterol in the skin, and when the sun hits the subcutaneous cholesterol in the skin, it ends up going to the liver, and the liver makes these precursors, and then it goes to the kidneys, and the kidneys also help produce vitamin D. So you need healthy kidneys, healthy liver, you need good cholesterol in the diet, and sun exposure, which is why people that live in the Northeast tend to have lower vitamin D, because only from about mid-May to mid-September do we have direct sunlight. And the rest of the year, you should be testing yourself and supplementing as appropriate. Eicosanoids we'll go over. Eicosanoids are very important in terms of inflammation and blood clotting and producing stomach acids and temperature within your body. So we'll talk about eicosanoids such as prostaglandins and leukotrienes. I have a good visual on that. Okay, so we look at fatty acids. We'll see that fatty acids are a long carbon chain, and attached to each carbon is hydrogen. If you look at the top where you have palmitic acid, you'll see that it looks different than oleic acid just underneath it. And that's because if you look at that kink right in the middle, there's a double bond. Okay, that double bond is considered to make this monounsaturated compared to saturated, right? There's saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats is when every carbon has a hydrogen and it makes this very rigid straight line. When there's a double bond, it creates a kink. This kink is like a bent elbow. It adds to the flexibility. We want to make sure that cell membranes have a very flexible cell membrane so things can be moving in and out. Okay. When you have this glycerol backbone on the bottom and we want to add a fatty acid to it, now we're going through this process called dehydration synthesis because we're taking something smaller and we're making it larger. Remember, dehydration synthesis, it's creating that water, that H2O at the end. Now, if we do this 1, 2, 3 times, we have a triglyceride. You go from a mono to a di to a triglyceride, which we see here. Triglycerides provide protection, insulation, and energy. So here on the top, right, it's saturated fat, that's palmitic. Below it is stearic acid. It's just a longer carbon chain, but it's saturated. And then here's oleic at the bottom, which is unsaturated. And again, you see H2O at the end of each of these, dehydration synthesis. 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol backbone is a triglyceride. Phospholipids are an important part of the cell membrane. What we're seeing here at the top, here, that's your phosphate group, right? There's your PO4. And then here is your lipid. So the cell membrane, which we see here, is a phospholipid membrane because if we look at this here, you have two layers of it, one here and one here. So water likes this side, water likes this side. In the middle is the fat. We know that if you try and dissolve olive oil, a fat, into water, it doesn't, right? So that's hydrophobic. So phospholipids consist of a lipid molecule, as we saw, joined to a phosphate. They act as the structural component of fat cells, and they're also used by the body to emulsify fats. Phospholipids are actually involved in fat emulsification. We will get more into that in AMP2 when we get into digestion, but here we're just laying down some foundational work. The phospholipid, as shown in that illustration on the last page, has a phosphate group, the PO4. That PO4 is the hydrophilic end, it likes water, and then it has the lipid portion, which is the inner part of the cell membrane. That is the hydrophobic portion. And again, there's the head, the phosphate, and there are the tails. Hydrophilic, hydrophobic. On the bottom there is the phospholipid membrane. It makes it selectively permeable. Okay, with steroids are needed to make cholesterol, your sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone, cortisol. These all fall under the classification of steroids. Cholesterol is the structural basis of all body steroids. We can ingest cholesterol from eggs, from milk, from cheese, but our liver makes 80% of what we need. There is no cholesterol cap in terms of our diet. It used to be thought that you have to be careful eating foods high in milk and high in cheese and high in eggs because of the cholesterol. It's not like eating that is going to increase your serum cholesterol very much. Okay? It is what your liver makes. If the liver is making lots of cholesterol, there's a physiological demand for that. Typically, and for most people, your body produces lots of cholesterol to fix damage to the blood vessels. So people with high blood sugar, the high glucose levels are going to damage the internal lining of a blood vessel. People with high blood pressure, it's like constant pounding against the inside of the blood vessel wall. It damages that lining. It's like a snow plow, when it drops its blade on a main street, it makes potholes. And then you have Department of Transportation, DOT, puts new asphalt or tar to pack that in. The packing of new tar to fill in that hole, that damage on the road, would be equivalent to the body producing cholesterol to patch up damage in the internal lining of blood vessels. So it's a good response to the damage, but when it accumulates and accumulates, then we have a problem, and that can actually create clots in people. All right. Bile salts, these are the breakdown products of cholesterol. It's released by the liver into the digestive tract, where the bile is needed to help to break down fat. Vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. Again, we went over how our bodies can produce vitamin D. You need good UV light. It's called UVB rays. Those UVB rays hit the subcutaneous cholesterol on the skin. It goes to the liver, and then it also goes to the kidneys, and both organs are needed to make vitamin D. Most people in the Northeast, based on their blood test, the 25-OH or 25-hydroxide, optimally we want to see that somewhere around 40 to 50. Most people are deficient. Okay, the darker the skin, the more likely deficient you are. So always important to get your vitamin D tested twice a year, in the summer months and in the winter. If you're outdoors in the summer, you don't have to supplement as much as you typically would in the autumn and winter months. I have so many patients that are on 5,000 international units. We have some on 10,000, and then we gauge it through blood chemistry to make sure they're in um, a healthy dosage of that. Vitamin D is also very helpful with the immune system, especially in times of COVID. The vitamin D, zinc, and the glutathione, very important. Sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, testosterone, these are sex hormones. We need cholesterol and we need fat to produce them. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid. It's involved in regulating not just blood sugar, but also blood pressure. Vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin K, and CoQ10, these are all fat-soluble vitamins. So if the person doesn't have fat in their diet, or in terms of body composition, the fat percentage is very low, then they have very difficult time in the absorption of these fat-soluble vitamins. Vitamin A is found in orange and yellowish pigmented vegetables and fruits. It's converted in the eye, in the retina, to retinal. It's involved in vision. Vitamin A is also needed for epithelial membranes. We'll talk about epithelial membranes when we get into tissues. We'll talk about epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Vitamin E is ingested in plant products like wheat germ and green leafy vegetables. It's important for fertility, to help heal wounds. It's an antioxidant. It helps to neutralize free radicals, so it has anti-cancer properties. Vitamin K for coagulation. It's needed for blood clotting. And our intestines have the ability of producing vitamin K. But just keep in mind, when a baby is born, the intestines tend to be more sterilized because they haven't eaten yet and they haven't done any breastfeeding yet. So this is why they inject many babies, with vitamin K in case there's any internal bleeding from a traumatic birth. If they inject the baby with vitamin K, it helps them clot. CoQ10, coenzyme Q10 that I mentioned before, it's not a vitamin, it's a coenzyme. It's needed by the mitochondria for that ETC, the electron transport chain, for the ability to produce adenosine triphosphate, or energy production. What needs a lot? Your muscles need it. The nerves need it. Anything that's constantly functioning needs CoQ10. It needs those mitochondria. So what ends up happening with people who are on statin drugs to lower their cholesterol, it ends up depleting, even though it's blocking cholesterol, in the cholesterol pathway, in producing cholesterol. In that same pathway is the body's ability to produce CoQ10. So when you block the enzyme that's needed to produce cholesterol, you also block the same enzyme that is needed to produce CoQ10. So that means the mitochondria don't work properly with deficient CoQ10. So what starts to hurt? Muscles cry for pain. They call that fibromyalgia. Anything that ends in algia is pain. So neuralgia is nerve pain. Arthralgia, joint pain. Myalgia, muscle pain. So anyone that's on a statin drug like Lipitor, Crestor, Simvastatin, anything that's lowering the body's ability to produce cholesterol, they should certainly be supplementing with coenzyme Q10, CoQ10. Eicosanoids, these are lipid type derived from a fatty acid called arachidonic acid. So one of the eicosanoids is called prostaglandins and the other is called leukotrienes. They're both needed for the human body. They're not bad, they're both needed. You need prostaglandins, which are involved in regulating blood pressure. Prostaglandins help a woman's uterus contract. It's involved with inflammation. Prostaglandins help produce mucus in the stomach, so it's involved in preventing stomach ulcers. It helps to dilate the airways, to open them up. It regulates body temperature. It's involved in blood clot formation. So if a person uses aspirin you're blocking prostaglandins. If they use non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs or NSAIDs, these are called COX inhibitors, you can block. Think about if a woman is having contractions and they take an NSAID or they take aspirin. Now their stomach cramps aren't as bad. But if you use too much NSAIDs or too much aspirin, can't they develop a bleeding ulcer in the stomach? Yes, because prostaglandins produce mucus, which lines the stomach. In this case, if there's more stomach acid and not enough mucus, then you get an ulcer. It regulates body temperature. So if you take aspirin, all of a sudden the fever that's going up comes down. If you take aspirin, aspirin is a blood thinner, then you can't form clots. And leukotrienes are involved with allergies. They're also involved with the airways primarily. When leukotrienes are in high concentrations, they're involved with asthma, with that constricted airway. So leukotriene blockers are very helpful with people with asthma. So if we look here all the way on top, you've got the cell membrane, which is made of phospholipids, with this enzyme, right? Sugars end in ose, enzymes end in ACE, ASE. So phospholipases are going to pull out lipids, these phospholipids, from the cell membrane, and a biggie is arachidonic acid. Now, there's an enzyme called COX, C-O-X, or cyclogenase. That cyclogenase acts on arachidonic acid, as does 5-lipoxygenase, or 5-LOX is another enzyme. But the COX enzyme on the left, when you have cyclogenase, that's involved in producing these inflammatory prostaglandins that are needed. Prostacyclin, or PGI2, thromboxanes, or TXA2, and then PGE2s. These are very necessary for normal physiology. But if we take COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitors or aspirin, these are going to block the COX enzyme so that the person is not in an inflamed state. Okay, so these COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitors block the inflammatory pathway. They inhibit all of these things from happening on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you can see if you have this constriction of the airway or bronchospasms, if you take a 5-LOX inhibitor, like some of these inhalers for asthma, then you don't get the constriction of the airway. They dilate and open up. Okay? All right, so that brings the lipids to an end. Let's look at proteins. Proteins are extremely important. It's the most abundant organic compound of the body. In terms of function, there are structural proteins like collagen, keratin, elastin, so super important for the structural support of the body. Movement proteins, these are contractile proteins. Actin and myosin are huge, very important contractile proteins when we get into muscle physiology. We'll get into muscle physiology later in the term. Transport proteins. Hemoglobin is a transport protein. It's going to help to transport oxygen in the blood. Lipoprotein. Lipoprotein is going to transport lipids and cholesterol throughout the body. Okay? Proteins are involved in buffering. We spoke about buffers before. It's going to assist any change in pH. pH stands for potential hydrogen or percentage hydrogen. Remember that scale goes from 0 to 14. Anything from 0 to 6.9999999 is going to be an acid, 7 is neutral, and anything above 7 is an alkaline or base. Albumin acts as an acid and base to prevent these wide swings in pH. A catalyst, there's a little typo there, but catalyst, not catalysis. Enzymes are proteins that act as a catalyst, meaning they're designed to accelerate chemical reactions to happen faster. Proteins are also involved in regulating metabolism, like hormones, growth hormone, insulin. Okay. Neurotransmitters. These are all things that come from proteins. Also, we need protein for our immune system, for our defenses. Tough, waterproof proteins are found in the skin, hair, and nails to protect us, right? We have some elastin in the skin. We have collagen in the skin. We have proteins called antibodies that are components of the immune system to help protect us against foreign matter. We have clotting proteins that help restrict bleeding after an injury takes place. So again, review these proteins, the types of proteins, and their functions. If we look at an amino acid, you'll see that right in the center, we have a central carbon, and then we have, it looks like, two functional groups. Here on the left is the amine group, the NH2, and on the right is your carboxyl, COOH. And on the bottom is the reactant group. So here are different types of amino acids. If you look right on the left-hand side in the center and the left is glycine. This is probably the most simple amino acid because you have your central carbon, you have a hydrogen, the amine group, and the carboxyl. And this has one hydrogen. That's glycine. It's an inhibitory type of neurotransmitter. Then, if we change the reactant group to this, now we have cysteine. If we change the reactant group to this, lysine, and then if we change it here, we have tyrosine. Each of these amino acids have a different type of structure, which means they each have different type of function. Cysteine, you heard me talk about before when I mentioned glutathione, that very important antioxidant. The antioxidant, the most powerful antioxidant we can produce internally, as long as we have good protein in our diet, strong digestive enzymes in the stomach that can break the protein down to amino acids into the three amino acids super important to make glutathione: glycine, glutamine, and cysteine. Cysteine of all three is the weak link, which is why many people supplement with something called NAC, especially a lot of athletes. I take care of a lot of athletes that have high amounts of oxidative stress in their body from training very hard, but they don't have enough antioxidant support, so they get sick. Typically, the people who are the most unhealthiest are the most athletic if they don't have the right type of guidance. It's because they train super hard without the right antioxidant support. So they substitute NAC, NAC, which stands for N-acetylcysteine. Now when they supplement with NAC, which is the weakest link, they have glutamine and glycine plus the NAC, the cysteine portion, now they then can produce glutathione. Pretty amazing how that works. Lysine on the bottom right, where have you heard that? Many people that are getting a herpes breakout in the lip, once they feel that sting or that burning or the blisters that start to form, they take L-lysine in high concentrations because lysine competes with arginine. Arginine is where the herpes virus thrives on. So if there's arginine in excess, you're going to have herpes that's going to manifest and grow. If you take high concentrations of lysine that competes with arginine, it kind of helps it along very well. It helps the healing of it. And tyrosine is super important as an amino acid because from tyrosine, if you have 4 iodines that attach to tyrosine, you take the T from tyrosine and add the 4 iodines, you get T4, or thyroxine. And thyroxine is a thyroid hormone. And T4 gets converted into T3, which is triiodothyronine. Okay, here, just showing how these peptide bond formation, just to show you on the left, we have glycine plus alanine, we have these 2 amino acids, and look, dehydration synthesis going from these 2 small amino acids into a dipeptide, and it forms water at the end. If you take water with this dipeptide, it breaks them down into 2 amino acids. We use that water, that's hydrolysis or hydrolysis. The structural organization in protein on the left-hand side, we have these amino acids, we have these peptide bonds holding them together. This is the primary structure. There's an amino acid type of sequence. We have these hydrogen bonds holding this together. That's the secondary structure. We can see a twisting and folding of the neighboring amino acids, and it's stabilized by hydrogen bonds. These hydrogen bonds can be broken if there's too much oxidative stress. So you want to have antioxidants to protect against breaking that. Then there's a tertiary structure, which is this three-dimensional shape of the polypeptide, right? It starts to fold and fold. And then you have a quaternary structure, which is the arrangement of two or more polypeptide chains. Enzyme is a catalyst in a living cell. Again, these enzymes are highly specific, they're extremely efficient, and they speed up reaction time. So enzymes act as a catalyst. Enzymes always end in ase. So if you have a lipid, which is a fat, and you want something to break it down, you need a lipase. If you have a carbohydrate and we want something to break it down, you need a carbohydrase. If you have a protein and you want to break that down, you need a protease. All right. If you think of protein like a steak, and we put a steak outside and you put it on black tar on a 100-degree day, is it really going to cook that steak? Yes, but it may take hours and hours and hours at 100 degrees. But if you denature the protein at a much higher temperature, like a barbecue at 600 to 500 degrees, you could denature the proteins, cook that steak in probably 20 minutes, right? But the body temperature doesn't get to 500 degrees, right? The human body is 98 degrees, 97 degrees. Maybe a fever 105, but still not enough, high enough temperature to break down a steak inside the body, but we have digestive enzymes. You have that hydrochloric acid in the stomach. So enzymes can speed up the reaction time and break down those proteins in the stomach. But you need cofactors at times. So calcium, magnesium, zinc, some of those trace elements act as cofactors. Cofactors help to pull the trigger, right? It's like having a loaded gun. You can have a gun sitting on a table loaded with bullets, but it's harmless. It's not going to do anything. It has to get into the hands of someone that's going to pull the trigger. So having an enzyme is important, but you need a cofactor to pull the trigger to activate it, to set it into motion. So here on the top, we can see that we have the substrates. You have sucrose, which is sugar, and water. Now we have an enzyme called sucrase. Well, sucrase, the enzyme, is going to work on sucrose. Remember, sucrose is glucose and fructose combined, and water. So we're using that enzyme, the sucrase, to break down, and look what happens. When you break this down, you end up with the two monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. By the way, what happens to the enzyme? It remains untouched. It's utilized over and over and over again. Okay? So again, click on that link so you can review enzyme functions, how it works, and ATP. All right, we're on that last topic now, I believe, nucleic acids. DNA, not to be confused with RNA. So DNA forms the genetic code in the nuclei of the body cells, and it regulates most of the cell's activities. RNA, on the other hand, is guiding the protein formation. So DNA is the template. It has the instructions, but it's not actually producing protein. It's just the code for what proteins need to be produced. Maybe some proteins to make bones, some proteins to make your hair, your eyes, to make neurotransmitters, but the RNA is guiding that formation. So nucleic acids are large organic molecules. They're found in the nucleus, which store and process information at the molecular level. DNA, the deoxyribose nucleic acid, is going to determine your inherited characteristics. It's going to direct protein synthesis, right? It contains the directions. It controls enzyme production. It's going to control your metabolism. But the RNA, the ribose nucleic acid, this is going to control the intermediate steps in protein synthesis. The structure of nucleic acids, the DNA and RNA, are a string of nucleotides. These nucleotides are the building blocks of DNA and RNA. They're going to have these three moving parts. It's going to have a pentose sugar, right? That five-sided sugar looks like a house. It's going to have a phosphate group, PO4, and then it's going to have these nitrogenous bases. It's going to have adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine, or uracil, depending on if it's DNA, it's cytosol, and cytosine, gosh, and then in RNA, it's going to be uracil. Okay, DNA and RNA. DNA is a double-stranded. DNA, again, is double-stranded, and the bases form hydrogen bonds to hold the DNA together. Sometimes the RNA can bind itself, but it's usually a single strand. So DNA is going to be twisting. It's going to be forming what's called this double helix. It's going to have these complementary pairs. So, yep, you can see I made my error there. Talking about cysteine and cytosine and cytosol. So let me make the correction here. I'm glad I caught it. So with DNA, these pairs are the A and the T, adenine and thymine. The C is cytosine. Okay, I think I got that right. I think I did get the cytosine correct. And it's going to bind with G, which is guanine. All right, so the A and the T's pair up, adenine and thymine, and then cytosine and guanine, the C and the G pair up. In RNA, the uracil is going to replace thymine. Okay, so if we go back, actually, I think it's coming up. So if you look here on the bottom right, you can see the A and the T pairing up, and the C and the G. All right, and again on top, you can see the T is thymine, the C is for cytosine, A is for adenine, and the G is for guanine. So the G and the C forms bonds, and the A and the T forms bonds. Here is your pentose sugar. That's your five-sided sugar. And then you have your phosphate group. All right, so the nucleotide is made up of the nitrogenous bases, AGTC, the pentose sugar, and the phosphate group. You can see the DNA is that double helix. The main function of DNA is that storage and transfer of the information essential for the synthesis of protein. But it's not actually producing. The production and the protein synthesis is really where the RNA comes into play. All right, so again, you've got the nitrogenous bases, you have the cytosine and the thymine, the T and the C. You have the adenine and guanine, that would be A and G. So the A and the T's, the thymine and the adenine pair up, and then the C and the G's, the cytosine and the guanine pair up. And the ones that are interchangeable are the U and the T, uracil and thymine when we talk about RNA. The DNA is needed to determine the characteristics of your eye color, your hair color, and your blood type. The DNA has the codes for the information needed to build the proteins. It's what's utilized to identify certain criminals, right? Victims, it tends to pair up children with their parents. And all you need is a strand of hair, a drop of semen, or a drop of blood for that. And again, here's your DNA. You can see DNA is made up of the two strands twisted in that spiral staircase-like structure called the double helix. And each strand consists of nucleotides that are bound together. They're bound together by hydrogen bonds, right? So if those hydrogen bonds become damaged, you could do a lot of damage to your DNA. Each nucleotide consists of a deoxyribose bound to a phosphate group and then to the nitrogenous bases. Adenine for A, thymine T, guanine G, and cytosine C. C and G's hook up, A and T's hook up. The nitrogenous bases pair together through hydrogen bonding to form the actual steps, or that bridge, of the double helix. The adenine pairs with thymine, and guanine pairs with cytosine. Now, RNA differs from DNA. It's not, your RNA is single-stranded compared to double-stranded DNA. The sugar is a ribose sugar, not a deoxyribose sugar. And in RNA, you got that uracil nitrogenous base that replaces thymine. There's messenger RNA that's involved with transcription. There's ribosomal RNA and transfer RNA. Now, these are the proteins that are involved actually in protein synthesis. To perform their vital functions, cells must use energy obtained from breaking down organic substrates. When you're breaking things down, that's catabolism. A high energy bond is the covalent bond whose breakdown, remember I said when you break down bonds, you release energy for the cell to use. And in our cells, a high energy compound connects a phosphate group to an organic molecule. Each time you add a phosphate group, that's called phosphorylation. So here in AMP, let me just show you. So if we have adenosine, one adenosine, and we phosphorylate it one time, we add a phosphate, you have adenosine monophosphate. If we phosphorylate it again, now we have adenosine diphosphate, that's the D. Now, adenosine triphosphate is a third phosphate attached to it, okay? ATP is needed for muscle contraction. It's needed to transport substances across a cell membrane, especially when you're moving things against a concentration gradient. Okay, a concentration gradient is if we have a cell, and there's more sodium outside than there is inside, so I'm going to make this small on the inside. So there's more sodium outside than inside. Things that follow the concentration gradient go from where there's something more of to where there's something less of. So things can passively move extracellularly to intracellularly. No energy is needed for that. But to go from where you have a small concentration to a large concentration, that's like swimming against the tide. That requires ATP to do that, right? It takes energy to swim against the tide or to walk against the wind. Okay, so we also need energy to move things within the cell, not just in and out. Okay? All right, so the big picture in terms of energy production. So we breathe in oxygen and we give out CO2. Inspiration, expiration. When the cell is providing energy, we call that cellular respiration, aka also known as the Krebs cycle. Cellular respiration. We take in oxygen, and each time that oxygen is taken in, it's oxidizing and breaking down the glucose to produce energy. So the mitochondria needs oxygen. That's the only reason why we're breathing. It's to produce ATP. It's to break down the sugar for fuel. So we breathe in oxygen and we give off CO2. Where is the CO2 coming from? The CO2, if you look all the way down at the bottom, it's coming from the mitochondria. You see, it says cellular respiration. When we take glucose and it's oxidized, you see that little O2 there on the bottom? It's taking that sugar and it's breaking it down, and the byproduct is carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Well, ATP we're going to use for fuel. The water is constructive to the body, but not so much the CO2. The carbon dioxide is very, very dangerous in high concentrations. This is one of the issues many people have with wearing certain type of masks, is that they're breathing in oxygen, which we're supposed to. They breathe out CO2, and the next time, is there enough oxygen? No. But they're taking in CO2, that which by nature we're trying to get rid of. So many people are hypersensitive and have issues with wearing masks. So physiologically, we can certainly understand the problem there, right? Okay, so the CO2 that the mitochondria is getting rid of, we exhale. We breathe in, inhalation. The body's going to use that oxygen to break down the glucose. We're going to produce water, which we can use, energy we can use, and the CO2, which we exhale. What happens to the carbon dioxide that we exhale? The trees use it. It utilizes the CO2, it takes it in, and then gives off oxygen, clean oxygen that we can breathe in. Look at that beautiful part of the ecosystem. Okay? So, if we look here, now you have glucose on the top. Glucose is rushing in. What we have at the bottom is the cell. So you can see there's a cell membrane right there. So glucose can enter the cell membrane, but now glucose is in the cytoplasm or the cytosol. Now glucose is broken down by glycolysis. That's the splitting of that 6-carbon sugar into pyruvate, which is nothing other than 2 3-carbon sugars. In the presence of oxygen, pyruvate can enter the mitochondria in where the citric acid cycle takes place, or the Krebs cycle, as well as the electron transport chain to produce ATP. We give off water and carbon dioxide. CO2 is what we exhale. If pyruvate is there, but there's not enough oxygen, then the pyruvate is converted to lactic acid. This is what happens when someone's exercising and then they get out of breath and they don't have enough oxygen, their muscles start burning. That's the lactic acid. That's the burn that many people feel. The lactic acid is just another type of sugar. Lactic acid can be converted back to pyruvate when oxygen is available. That's when you're huffing, you're puffing, then you slow down, you rest, you get your oxygen levels back up. Lactic acid can be converted back into pyruvate. Pyruvate can then enter the mitochondria for more ATP production. So glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. It's that initial step to producing energy, but then the actual Krebs cycle and ATP production, the majority of that ends up taking place in the mitochondria. The Krebs cycle is producing that NAD and FAD, which ends up being utilized for the electron transport chain to produce ATP. The Krebs cycle really takes the B vitamins, B1, 2, and 3, B1, 2, and 3 for energy. It takes the B vitamins, whereas your electron transport chain needs the magnesium. It needs iron. It needs CoQ10. So if there's deficiency in any of those, you can understand how energy metabolism becomes affected and becomes reduced. So proper nutrition, vitamins, and minerals is really important for energy production. Hydrolysis or hydrolysis of ATP is the removal of a terminal phosphate group. And that enzyme that's needed to break down ATP for energy, to release energy, is called adenosine triphosphatase, or ATPase. That's going to release energy. But what you're left with is ADP. Right? If you remove a phosphate group, you don't have ATP, you got adenosine diphosphate. But if you need to make energy, if you need to synthesize ATP, we use another enzyme. It's called ATP synthase. That's going to add a terminal phosphate group to ADP, so you're building up. You're going from ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Okay? All right, so then just make sure you go over and summarize what we covered in the first video, which is the inorganic molecules, water, acids and bases and salts, And then the carbohydrates, which we talk about primarily, the organic compounds, which are carbs, fats, proteins, and the nucleic acids. And then we finished with energy, right? That phosphate group.